Christopher Columbus was an explorer from Europe. He believed the world was round, like a big ball. He thought he could sail west across the vast Atlantic Ocean to reach the East Indies. For many weeks, he and his sailors traveled on 3 small wooden ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The journey was long and, honestly, sometimes scary. The sailors saw nothing but endless water for days and days. They looked for land, hoping to see a sign that their difficult voyage was almost over. They wondered what they would find at the end of their path. The open sea was a huge, mysterious place, and their ships felt very small in the middle of it all. Finally, after more than 2 months at sea, a lookout shouted, "Land!" Everyone rushed to the side of the ships to look. In the distance, they could see a green island with white sandy beaches. It was a beautiful sight for the tired sailors. They had made it. Columbus and his crew had crossed the great ocean and arrived at a place they had never seen before. They were filled with excitement and relief. The long days of uncertainty were behind them. Now, a new adventure was just beginning on this unknown shore, a place that would later be called the New World. It was a moment that would change the world forever. The sailors prepared small boats to row to the shore. They were curious about this new land. What kind of trees grew there? What animals lived in the forests? Most importantly, were there any people? Columbus carried the royal flag of Spain, the country that had paid for his incredible journey. He and his men were the first people from Europe to set foot on this island. They felt a mix of pride and wonder as their boots sank into the soft sand. The air was warm, and strange new bird songs filled the sky. Everything was different from their homes in Spain. As they looked around, Columbus named the island San Salvador. He claimed it for the King and Queen of Spain, who had believed in his dream of sailing west. The sailors knelt on the ground and gave thanks for their safe arrival. They were exhausted from their long time at sea, but also full of energy to explore. They looked at the tall, strange trees and the colorful flowers that grew everywhere. This land was so different from Europe. It was a paradise, a place of mystery and promise. They had no idea that they were not alone, and that they were about to meet the people who called this island home. Suddenly, people began to appear from behind the trees. They were the native people who had lived on the island for a very long time. They were just as surprised to see Columbus and his men as the sailors were to see them. These strangers had arrived on giant floating houses and wore peculiar, heavy clothes and shiny metal helmets. The natives had never seen anything like it before. They watched the newcomers from a distance, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and immense curiosity. Who were these pale-skinned men? Where did they come from? Their world, once so familiar, now held a great and sudden mystery. Columbus and his sailors looked back at the native people. They saw that the natives had brown skin and dark hair. The sailors noticed that the people were gentle and peaceful. They did not carry any weapons. Instead, they approached slowly, with open hands and curious expressions. The sailors, who had been ready for anything, were relieved to see that the inhabitants were not hostile. This first meeting was quiet and cautious. Both groups stood on the beach, separated by a world of different experiences, languages, and cultures, yet connected by a shared sense of human wonder. The native people were part of a group called the Taino. They were fascinated by the ships, which they thought might be giant creatures from the sea. They were also very interested in the sailors' beards and their pale skin, which was so different from their own. The Taino people came closer, their initial shyness giving way to their inquisitive nature. They pointed at the ships and then at the sky, perhaps asking where these visitors had come from. The sailors tried to communicate using hand gestures, pointing to themselves and then to their ships, trying to explain their long journey across the water. This first encounter was a moment of pure discovery for both sides. The Taino had lived in their island world for generations, and now, strangers from an entirely different world had appeared on their shores. For Columbus and his men, they had found not an empty land, but a place full of people with their own way of life. The air was filled with unspoken questions. The sailors wondered about the lives of these people, and the Taino wondered about the world beyond their ocean horizon. It was a silent conversation between two parts of humanity that had never met before. Columbus wanted to show the native people that he and his crew came in peace. He decided to offer them gifts, things they had brought with them all the way from Europe. He opened chests filled with simple but fascinating items. The sailors brought out small, round bells that made a cheerful tinkling sound when shaken. The Taino people had never heard such a sound before, and they listened with delight. The sailors also presented shiny red caps, which the natives happily placed on their heads. These small presents were a way to build trust and show goodwill between the two very different groups of people. The sailors continued to share their European goods. They showed the natives colorful glass beads that sparkled in the bright sunlight. The Taino people treasured these beads, holding them up to the light to see the colors dance. They had never seen glass before. They strung the beads together and wore them as beautiful jewelry. To the sailors, these were simple trinkets, but to the Taino, they were exotic treasures from a faraway place. This exchange of simple items was the first trade between the old world and the new, a peaceful moment of sharing and mutual fascination. The native people also had things to share. They offered the sailors fresh water, delicious fruits that the Europeans had never tasted, and soft balls of cotton thread. They also brought parrots with bright green and red feathers, which amazed the sailors. This exchange of gifts was a way for both groups to learn about each other. It was a simple form of communication when words were not understood. Each object told a small story about the world it came from, whether it was a glass bead from a European workshop or a tropical fruit grown on the island. Through these exchanges, a connection began to form. The sailors were surprised by the generosity of the Taino people, who freely gave what they had. The Taino were amazed by the manufactured goods of the Europeans. They would touch the sailors' clothing and their swords, though they did not understand what the swords were for. The meeting was filled with gestures of friendship and curiosity. It was a peaceful beginning, where two cultures met, not with conflict, but with an exchange of simple gifts that represented two vastly different worlds colliding for the very first time. The sailors took note of everything they saw, including what the native people wore. Their clothing was very simple and perfectly suited for the warm island climate. Many of the men and women wore very little, but some wore small cloths made of a light woven fabric. This fabric was linen, made from the fibers of the flax plant. The clothes were plain and practical, designed for comfort in the tropical heat. They were not decorated with fancy patterns or bright dyes like the clothes in Europe. The simplicity of their attire was another sign of how different their way of life was. The simple linen clothes were a stark contrast to the sailors' heavy European outfits. Columbus and his crew wore thick tunics, leggings, and leather boots. In the tropical sun, their clothes were hot and uncomfortable. They must have looked at the natives' light clothing with a bit of envy. The natives, in turn, must have wondered why these strangers wore so many layers. The differences in their clothing highlighted the vast gap between their two worlds. One was a world of nature and simplicity, the other a world of industry and complex customs. The meeting between Columbus and the Taino people was a moment of incredible surprise for everyone. The sailors were amazed to find a land so rich and people so gentle and generous. They had expected to find the spices and silks of Asia, but instead, they found something entirely new and unexpected. The natives were equally astonished. They had lived their lives with the ocean as their boundary, never imagining that people could exist beyond the endless water. The arrival of the ships and the strange men was an event beyond their wildest dreams. This encounter on a small island in 1492 marked a turning point in history. It was the first time that people from the eastern and western hemispheres had met. This meeting opened up a new chapter for humanity, connecting continents that had been separated for thousands of years. While the future would bring many changes and challenges, this first moment was one of shared wonder and peaceful curiosity. It was a brief, quiet time on a sandy beach when two different worlds looked at each other with awe, forever changing the story of our planet.